The chamber doors sealed behind me with a sound like a coffin closing, and I knew there was no walking back out until this was over. 17 alien delegations sat above me in a ring of dark glass seats, each one lit from below so their faces looked carved from stone. I stood alone on the chamber floor, in my dress uniform, with nothing in my hands and nowhere to hide. My name is Elias Voss, Fleet Commander of the Sol Defense Command, and in exactly 4 minutes the Coalition Tribunal was going to accuse humanity of the worst crime a species could commit in this galaxy: breaking the combat accord. The Jarn ambassador rose first. His name was Prosecutor Thren, and he had a voice that could freeze water. He did not waste time with greetings. "Commander Voss," he said, "you stand before this tribunal on a charge that has not been filed against any coalition member in over 300 cycles. Your fleet, during the Kesserine border engagement, is accused of conducting warfare through deception, concealment, and dishonorable tactics that fall far outside the accepted limits of the combat accord." A murmur rolled through the chamber like wind through dry grass. I did not answer right away. I let the silence sit there, heavy, because I wanted every delegate in that room to feel the weight of what was coming. 3 days earlier, none of us knew this hearing would even happen. 3 days earlier, I was standing on the bridge of my ship, the Meridian, watching sensor readouts light up red across the Kesserine border, and the only thing on my mind was keeping my crew alive. The Jarn fleet had crossed into contested space with 11 warships. We had 4. On paper, it was already over before it began. Their captains transmitted a formal challenge, demanding we meet them in open engagement, ships lined in a single visible formation, as their customs required. It was tradition for them. Combat as ceremony. Combat as proof of strength, not survival. I remember Charlotte Bennett, my tactical officer, staring at the screen with her jaw tight. She had flown with me for 6 years, and I had never seen her look afraid until that moment. "Commander," she said quietly, "if we line up the way they want, we lose every ship in under 10 minutes. I looked at the formation request scrolling across our display, polite and formal, almost beautiful in its confidence. They expected us to say yes. They expected humanity to play by rules, built for a war that was never meant to be survived, only performed. I remember keying the comm and giving an order that would end up dragged in front of this very tribunal. "Decline the formation," I said. "Scatter the fleet. Use the debris field for cover. We are not fighting their war. We are fighting ours." Back in the chamber, Prosecutor Thren's voice snapped me back to the present. "You ordered your ships to hide," he said, as if the word itself was an insult. "You used a debris field to mask your positions. You allowed damaged vessels to broadcast false distress signals to lure enemy ships into range. You feigned retreat not once, but twice. Do you deny any of this, Commander?" I looked up at him, and for the first time since I had entered that chamber, I let myself smile. It was not a smile of arrogance. It was the smile of a man who had done his homework long before anyone else in that room even knew there was homework to do. "I don't deny a single word of it," I said. The chamber went still. Somewhere above me, an alien delegate leaned forward so fast his chair creaked. Thren's confidence flickered, just slightly, like a candle catching a draft. He had expected denial. He had expected excuses. He had not expected agreement. "Then you confess," he said, recovering his tone, "to breaking the accepted principles of honorable combat as defined under the Interstellar Combat Accord." "No," I said. "I confess to winning a battle I was never supposed to win, using methods that are completely legal under an agreement your own delegation signed." Now the murmurs became something louder. Magistrate Kale, an elder from the Ethlorian judiciary seat, raised one long gray hand for silence. Her voice was calm, almost curious, in a way that made her far more dangerous than Thren's anger. "Explain yourself, Commander Voss," she said, clearly, and without theatrics. This tribunal does not reward performance. I turned toward her, grateful for the opening. "When humanity joined this coalition," I said, "we signed the combat accord like every other species in this room, but before we signed, Our legal delegation did something unusual. They read every clause, every footnote, every article most species assumed was decorative. I paused, letting that land. Article 12 of the Accord allows any signatory species to submit documented historical military doctrine as binding precedent, provided that doctrine existed before the species joined the coalition. It exists so that no single culture's idea of honorable warfare could be forced onto every other species that had a different history. Thren's eyes narrowed. A technicality. A rule, I corrected. One your own delegation helped write, because at the time, no one expected any species to actually use it. Most coalition militaries were built after joining, shaped entirely by the Accord itself. You have no history older than the treaty you are trying to enforce against me. I let my gaze move slowly across the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had gone very quiet. Humanity is different. Our species did not learn how to survive conflict from this coalition. We learned it across thousands of years, on our own world, against our own kind, long before we ever saw a star chart with your worlds on it. And every tactic I used at Kesserine, every scattered formation, every false signal, every retreat that was not truly a retreat, is documented, dated, and recorded in our history, centuries before humanity ever left our solar system. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, alien tongues clashing in argument and confusion, and for the first time since I walked through those sealed doors, I felt something other than fear. I felt the tide beginning to turn. Magistrate Kale raised her hand again, and slowly, the noise settled into a tense, electric silence. You are telling this tribunal, she said carefully, that your species submitted its own historical doctrine as legal precedent under Article 12. I am telling you, I said, that we did it the day we signed the Accord. Quietly, properly, through the correct channels. No one objected, because no one thought it would matter. Thren's composure cracked just slightly, a flash of something sharp and furious behind his eyes. This tribunal was not informed of any such submission. This tribunal, I said, did not ask. The words hung in the air like a blade balanced on its point. Somewhere behind the glass partitions, I caught sight of Henry Vance, our legal attaché, standing with a data slate, held against his chest like a shield. He gave me the smallest nod. It was the signal I had been waiting for. The proof was ready, the history was ready, and for the first time in this entire proceeding, the accusers were the ones who looked unprepared. Magistrate Kale studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the way only a being from a species far older than mankind could manage. Commander Voss, she said finally, you claim your species holds a defense buried within the very laws used to accuse it. I do. Then you will present it, she said, in full, before this entire tribunal, before every delegation seated in this chamber. Thren opened his mouth to object, but the magistrate raised her hand once more, silencing him with nothing but presence. If what the commander says is true, she said, then this tribunal is not simply judging one battle. It is judging whether it understands its own laws at all. I felt the weight of every eye in that chamber settle on me at once, and instead of shrinking under it, I stood a little taller. Because for the first time since this hearing began, I was no longer the one on trial. I was the one about to teach an entire galaxy something about humanity that we had never bothered to explain out loud, because until this moment, no one had ever needed us to. The doors at the rear of the chamber opened, and Henry Vance walked in carrying the one thing that could turn an accusation into a lesson. Our history. And I smiled again, because I knew exactly what was coming next, and so did every alien species in that room who had just realized they might not understand humanity nearly as well as they thought they did. Henry crossed the floor with quick, even steps, his boots echoing against the polished stone. He did not look at the delegates. He did not look at Thren. He looked only at me, and in his eyes I saw the same thing I had felt 3 days ago on the bridge of the Meridian, right before I gave the order to scatter the fleet. Not fear, readiness. He stopped beside me, and set the data slate on the small podium built into the chamber floor, the kind meant for evidence, for proof, for things that could not be argued away with words alone. "Commander," he said quietly, "just for me, they are not going to like what is on this slate." "They are not supposed to like it," I said. "They are supposed to understand it." Above us, Magistrate Kale watched the exchange without a flicker of expression, though I noticed several of the younger delegates leaning forward, curiosity beginning to outweigh outrage. Not every species in that chamber had come here already convinced of guilt. Some of them, I realized, were simply waiting to be shown something they had never considered before. Prosecutor Thren was not one of them. "This is a delay tactic," he said sharply, addressing the magistrate directly. "The commander stands accused of clear and documented misconduct. Whatever historical curiosities his legal officer intends to present, they do not erase what happened at Kesserine." "They do not need to erase it," I said, before the magistrate could respond. "They need to explain it. There is a difference between hiding from judgment and standing in front of it with the truth in your hands." Thren's jaw tightened, and for the briefest moment, I saw something behind his composure that looked almost like worry. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold authority he had walked in with, but I had seen it, and once you have seen a crack in something, you know it can break. Magistrate Kale turned her attention fully toward me now, her ancient eyes steady and unreadable. "Commander Voss," she said, "you have made a serious claim before this tribunal, that your species submitted historical precedent under Article 12 at the time of your coalition ratification, that this precedent legally justifies every action taken during the Kesserine engagement." "That is correct." "Then understand this," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, without ever rising in volume. "If your claim is false, this tribunal will not simply rule against you. It will rule against your entire species, and the consequences will extend far beyond one commander standing on this floor." I felt the weight of that warning settle over the room like a second gravity. Beside me, Henry did not move, did not flinch, and I understood why. We had already known this. We had known it from the moment we chose to walk into this chamber, instead of quietly accepting whatever judgment the coalition wanted to hand down. "I understand," I said, "and I would not have brought my legal officer forward, or asked for this hearing to continue, if I were not certain." Magistrate Kale studied me for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of pressure, pressing against my chest, testing whether my confidence was real or simply well performed. Then she nodded, once, and the entire chamber seemed to exhale at the same time. "Proceed," she said. Henry activated the data slate, and the chamber's central display flickered to life above us. Ancient text and dated archives beginning to scroll across the dark glass ceiling for every delegate in the room to see. I glanced at Thren one last time before the presentation began, and I saw it again, that same flicker of worry, quickly buried beneath practiced calm. He knew, somewhere beneath his certainty, that the ground beneath his accusation was no longer as solid as it had been 5 minutes ago. And I knew that what came next would decide not just my fate or the fate of the crew who had trusted me at Kesserine, but the way an entire galaxy would understand humanity from this day forward. The display above us steadied, and the first line of ancient human text appeared in bright, unmistakable letters, translated into every language spoken in that chamber at once. The room went silent, waiting, and I began to speak. Humanity did not join this coalition as a young species, learning war for the first time, I said. We joined it as a species that had already spent thousands of years learning how to survive it. Long before we saw a star chart with any of your homeworlds marked on it, we were fighting each other, nation against nation, army against army, and every one of those conflicts taught us something the rest of you have never had to learn. War does not care about fairness. It only cares about who is still standing when it ends. I nodded to Henry, and the display above us shifted, showing an ancient map, painted in ink centuries before humanity ever built a starship. Rivers, hills, and two armies drawn in careful detail, one twice the size of the other. 2,000 years ago, I said, a smaller human army faced a much larger one. In a battle now called Cannae, the larger force expected a straightforward clash, strength against strength, exactly the kind of engagement your accord calls honorable. Instead, the smaller army allowed its center to fall back, pulling the larger force forward into a trap, then closed around them from both sides. The larger army was defeated, not through greater strength, but through a plan built entirely on making the enemy believe they were winning until it was too late to matter. Thren's voice cut through the chamber before I could continue. A single ancient battle proves nothing. You could have invented this history the moment you realized you needed a defense. Then look at the second example, I said calmly, nodding to Henry again. The display changed. A wooden structure, shaped like an animal, standing before ancient stone walls. A conflict our historians call the Siege of Troy, I said. One side could not break through the walls of a fortified city through direct assault. Instead of throwing themselves against those walls until nothing remained of either force, they built a hollow structure, filled it with soldiers, and presented it as a gift, a symbol of surrender. The defenders brought it inside their own walls, believing the conflict was over. It was not. That single act of deception ended a struggle that direct combat could not. I let the image linger before continuing. For thousands of years afterward, this story has been taught to every human child, not as something shameful, but as one of the earliest lessons in our history. Victory does not always belong to the side with greater strength. Sometimes it belongs to the side willing to think differently. Magistrate Kale leaned forward slightly. You are suggesting this pattern is not isolated. That deception exists as a foundation across your entire military history. I am not suggesting it, I said. I am proving it. Henry advanced the display again, and this time it showed something far more recent. Grainy recordings of old human aircraft, radio towers, and coded transmissions. Centuries later, I said, during one of our largest global conflicts, an entire branch of human military strategy was built around convincing an enemy that an attack would happen in one location, while the true assault was prepared somewhere else entirely. Entire fake armies were built from wood and canvas. Entire radio networks broadcast false troop movements. Entire operations existed only to make an enemy believe something that was not true. This was not considered dishonorable among us. It was considered essential. It saved lives on both sides by shortening conflicts that might otherwise have lasted years longer. I paused, letting the weight of that settle across the chamber. When I ordered the Meridian and the rest of my fleet to scatter into the debris field at Kesserine, when I ordered damaged vessels to transmit distress signals that were not entirely accurate, when I allowed the Zarn fleet to believe we were retreating when we were repositioning, I was not inventing something new. I was applying a doctrine that predates human spaceflight by centuries, a doctrine documented, recorded, and taught openly within our own culture long before any of you had ever heard the word human. Thren rose from his seat, his composure finally slipping into something sharper. Doctrine does not equal law, Commander. This tribunal enforces the combat accord, not the folklore of your homeworld. Then let us discuss the accord itself, I said, turning fully toward him now. Article 12 exists precisely for this reason. It allows any signatory species to submit documented historical doctrine as binding precedent, provided that doctrine existed before ratification. It was written this way because the authors of the accord understood something important. No single culture's definition of honorable combat should be forced upon every other species in this coalition. I looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of delegates who had grown very quiet. Most species seated in this room built their military doctrine after joining the coalition, shaped entirely by the very accord they are now using to judge me. Their wars, historically, were rare, ritualized, fought to establish standing, not to ensure survival. Humanity's history is different. We fought not for ceremony but because losing meant the end of everything. Every tactic considered clever, every strategy considered essential in our history, exists because somewhere, At some point, someone's failure to think differently meant their side did not survive to write the next chapter. Magistrate Kale's expression remained composed, but something in her eyes had shifted, a kind of quiet reassessment happening behind ancient patience. "You are saying," she said slowly, "that this tribunal is not simply judging whether your tactics were dishonorable. It is judging whether an entire species' documented history can be dismissed in favor of standards written by cultures who never needed to develop that history themselves." "Yes," I said, "that is exactly what I am saying." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices again, sharper this time, delegates turning to one another in urgent, hushed argument. I caught fragments of translated speech from different corners of the room, confusion, disbelief, and in some voices, something that sounded almost like reluctant respect. Thren tried to regain control of the room, raising his voice above the noise. "Even if such precedent exists, submitting ancient doctrine centuries after your species left its homeworld does not automatically apply it to modern combat. The scale is different. The stakes are different. You cannot simply borrow the justification of the past to excuse the present." "I am not borrowing it," I said. "I am continuing it." I let Henry advance the display one final time, showing formal coalition ratification records, dated to the exact cycle humanity signed the accord, with a small, easily overlooked amendment attached beneath the signature line. "This submission was filed the same day our species joined this coalition," I said, "properly, through the correct legal channel, exactly as Article 12 requires. No objection was raised at the time, because no one anticipated it would ever be needed. It has waited, quietly, exactly where the law says it should, until the day it became necessary." Silence spread through the chamber like water finding its level. Magistrate Kale studied the record for a long moment, then looked back at me, and for the first time since I had entered this chamber, her expression carried something other than judgment. It carried genuine curiosity. "Commander Voss," she said, "you have presented documentation, historical precedent, and formal legal submission consistent with the requirements of Article 12. This tribunal will need time to verify authenticity, but I will say this plainly, for the record." She paused, letting her words settle over every delegate in that chamber. "If everything you have shown us today proves accurate, then this hearing is no longer simply about Commander Elias Voss or the Kesserine engagement. It is about whether this coalition understands the very laws it claims to enforce." Thren's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he had no immediate response. I stood there in the center of that chamber, surrounded by species who had walked in certain of my guilt, and felt the shape of the room beginning to change around me, slowly, deliberately, the way a battlefield shifts in the final moments before the outcome becomes clear. The truth was on the table now. All that remained was watching what an entire galaxy would choose to do with it. Magistrate Kale called a recess to allow the tribunal's archivist to verify the ratification record, and the moment the chamber doors opened, I felt the tension in my chest loosen for the first time in 3 days. It did not disappear. It only shifted shape, becoming something quieter, more patient, waiting for the next blow. Henry walked beside me through the corridor outside the chamber, his data slate finally lowered at his side. "That went better than I expected," he said. "It went exactly as we planned," I said. "Which is the part that worries me." He glanced at me sideways. "You think Thren has something left?" "I think a species that files a formal accusation this aggressive, this publicly, does not walk away quietly just because the law did not go their way," I said. "There is always a second plan. We just have not seen it yet." We had barely reached the observation lounge outside the main chamber when Charlotte Bennett met us there, still in her fleet uniform, her expression tight with the kind of controlled urgency that only comes from someone who has spent years learning not to panic out loud. "Commander," she said quietly, pulling me aside, "we picked up something on the tribunal's outer security net. A short-range vessel matching Zarn military configuration entered the station's docking perimeter 20 minutes ago. It was cleared through diplomatic channels, but its transponder does not match any registered delegation ship." My stomach tightened. Unregistered Zarn vessel, inside a coalition tribunal station, during a hearing accusing them of losing an argument in front of the entire galaxy. That is the situation, yes, Charlotte said. Henry's jaw tightened. If Thren's faction believes this ruling is about to go against them, and if the political cost of losing this publicly is high enough, they may not be willing to let the tribunal finish the process peacefully. You think they would attempt something inside a neutral station, I said, in front of 17 delegations? I think, Charlotte said carefully, that some species value winning more than they value how it looks afterward. I did not have time to answer before station security chimed an alert through the corridor speakers, calm and procedural, the kind of voice designed specifically not to cause panic even when panic might be exactly the correct response. Attention all delegations. Minor security discrepancy detected in Docking Bay 4. Personnel are asked to remain in designated areas until cleared. Charlotte's eyes met mine. Docking Bay 4 was the same sector where the unregistered vessel had entered. That is not a discrepancy, she said quietly. That is someone trying to sound calm while something goes wrong. I looked toward the sealed chamber doors, thinking of Magistrate Kale still inside, reviewing our historical record, thinking of every delegate who had just begun, for the first time, to consider that humanity might not be the villain they had expected. If something happened to this tribunal now, in the middle of verification, the truth we had just presented would never get the chance to matter. Henry, I said, stay with the delegation liaison. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I am securing station perimeter access for our own security detail, which is true enough to hold up. Elias, Henry said, using my given name for the first time since we had entered this station, which told me exactly how seriously he understood the moment. If this goes wrong, it will look like humanity caused a security incident during our own hearing. If this goes wrong, I said, and I do nothing, it will look a great deal worse. Charlotte was already moving, and I fell into step beside her, the two of us cutting through a side corridor reserved for tribunal security personnel, a route we had scouted quietly the moment we arrived at this station 3 days earlier, because neither of us had ever believed a hearing this important would pass without complication. The corridor lighting shifted from soft observation white to a dimmer amber as we crossed into the restricted access wing, and I could hear it before I could see it, the low hum of a vessel's engine idling far too close to a station module that was never meant to host active docking during a live tribunal session. Charlotte slowed at the final junction, raising one hand, and I stopped beside her, my back against the cold metal wall, listening. Voices. Zarn voices, low and urgent, speaking in a dialect I did not fully understand, but did not need to, because the tone told me everything the words could not. This was not a diplomatic misunderstanding. This was the beginning of Thren's second plan. Charlotte looked at me, her expression steady despite the tightness around her eyes, the same look she had given me 3 days earlier on the bridge of the Meridian, right before I ordered our fleet to scatter into a debris field and trust a doctrine written thousands of years before either of us was born. "Commander," she whispered, "what do we do?" I thought of Magistrate Kale's warning that this hearing was no longer about one battle, but about whether the coalition understood its own laws at all. I thought of every delegate inside that chamber beginning, slowly, to reconsider everything they believed about humanity, and I understood, standing in that dim corridor with danger humming somewhere just ahead of us, that surviving Kesserine had never truly been the hardest part of this fight. Surviving what came after the truth was spoken out loud, that was going to be the real test. "We do exactly what we did 3 days ago," I said quietly. "We do not walk into the fight they expect. We make sure the fight happens on our terms instead." Charlotte gave a short nod, already reaching for the comm unit clipped to her collar, and together we moved forward into the amber light, toward whatever Prosecutor Thren had decided to risk everything to prevent. The access hatch to Docking Bay 4 was sealed, its indicator light glowing a dull warning red, but the panel beside it had been overridden, its casing pried open just enough to bypass the station's own lock sequence. Whoever had done this had planned it before the hearing ever started, which told me this was never a reaction to today's proceedings. It was a contingency, prepared in case the tribunal did not go the way Thren's faction expected. Charlotte crouched beside the panel, studying the tampered wiring with quick, practiced eyes. This is not a station crew job. Someone with fleet-level access did this. Which means whoever is inside that bay came prepared to leave quickly, I said, one way or another. I did not want a confrontation with fists or weapons drawn, not inside a neutral tribunal station, not while the fate of an entire species still hung on the credibility of the argument I had just made. A struggle here would hand Thren exactly what he needed, proof that humanity could not be trusted even inside a chamber built for peace. So instead of forcing the hatch, I did what 3 days ago had saved my fleet at Kesserine. I gave them a story to believe. I keyed the station's internal comm channel, the one reserved for docking coordination, and let my voice carry through it with the calm, procedural tone of someone who belonged exactly where he stood. Docking Bay 4. This is Fleet Security, requesting immediate confirmation of vessel clearance. Station monitoring has flagged your transponder for cross-reference with Tribunal security. Please stand by for inspection, or depart the bay voluntarily within the next 2 minutes to avoid formal detainment. Charlotte glanced at me. Her half-smile appeared for the first time since the ambassador raised the accusation of us breaking combat rules. You are trying to convince them leaving quietly is still an option, she whispered. I am trying to convince them that staying costs more than they are willing to pay, I said. There is a difference. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the low hum of the idling engine on the other side of that hatch shifted in pitch, rising, the unmistakable sound of a vessel preparing rapid departure rather than confrontation. We had gambled correctly. Whoever was inside that bay was not there to fight. They were there to disappear the moment this hearing turned against them, taking with them any direct evidence connecting Thren's faction to whatever had been planned. By the time station security finally overrode the hatch fully, the bay was empty, the vessel already gone, slipping away through an authorized departure corridor before anyone could stop it. Charlotte exhaled slowly. They ran. They ran, I agreed, which means somewhere inside that chamber, Prosecutor Thren is about to receive news that his contingency has failed before it even started. We returned to the observation lounge just as station security finished sealing the docking sector, and Henry met us halfway down the corridor, his expression tight with barely contained relief. The tribunal is reconvening, he said. The archivists confirmed it, Elias. The ratification record is authentic. Article 12 was invoked exactly as you said, filed the same day, properly logged, untouched for years because no one ever thought it would need to be used. Charlotte allowed herself a short breath of satisfaction, but I felt something colder settle in my chest instead. Confirmation of the record was only half the fight. Thren was not a species that surrendered ground easily, and I suspected the true confrontation was still waiting for us behind those chamber doors. We stepped back inside just as Magistrate Kale called the session to order, and I noticed immediately that Thren's posture had changed. His earlier sharp confidence had thinned into something more brittle, more calculated, the look of someone recalculating an argument that no longer had the foundation it once did. This tribunal has confirmed the authenticity of the human submission under Article 12, Magistrate Kale announced, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. The precedent stands as valid. However, this tribunal must now determine whether such precedent should be permitted to justify tactics of this nature going forward, regardless of its legal standing. Thren seized the opening immediately, straightening as though nothing had happened outside these walls at all. Even accepting the legality of this submission, he said, this tribunal must consider the danger of the standard it sets. If any species may excuse extreme tactics simply by pointing to ancient doctrine, then any culture with a sufficiently brutal history could justify nearly anything under the banner of precedent. A ripple of agreement moved through several delegations, and I understood, watching it happen, that Thren had found the only argument strong enough to still matter. I stepped forward before the momentum could fully take hold. "I do not dispute that risk," I said. In fact, I would argue that risk is precisely why Article 12 was written the way it was. Magistrate Kale's gaze sharpened with interest. "Explain." Every species in this chamber built its combat doctrine at a different point in history, shaped by different pressures, different stakes, different survival conditions, I said. The combat accord, as it exists today, was largely shaped by species whose conflicts were rare, ritualized, and low in true existential risk. That is not a flaw in your histories. It is simply the truth of them. But it means the accord, as originally written, reflects only one kind of experience with war, not every kind. I turned slowly, meeting the eyes of delegates across the chamber, watching some of them begin, for the first time, to look inward rather than outward. Humanity's history includes conflict fought under the threat of true extinction, repeatedly, across our own world, long before we ever left it. Article 12 does not exist to excuse cruelty. It exists to prevent a single cultural experience with warfare, however well-intentioned, from being imposed as universal law over species whose survival depended on very different lessons. Thren opened his mouth to respond, but one of the quieter delegations, a Vresh representative who had said almost nothing throughout the entire hearing, rose instead. If this tribunal is only now recognizing that its own founding standards were shaped by limited experience, the Vresh delegate said slowly, then perhaps the greater danger was never the human precedent. Perhaps it was mistaking one history for the only history worth counting. Murmurs spread through the chamber again, quieter this time, more thoughtful than outraged. Magistrate Kale allowed the discussion to continue for several long minutes, delegation after delegation beginning to question, aloud, assumptions they had never before considered worth examining. I watched species who had entered this chamber utterly certain of humanity's guilt begin, instead, to reconsider the very foundation of the law they had built their certainty upon. Thren remained standing throughout it all, his expression rigid, watching the room slip further from his control with every passing moment. Finally, Magistrate Kale raised her hand, restoring silence across the chamber. "This tribunal will retire to render its ruling," she said. "When we return, it will not be simply to judge Commander Voss or the Kesserine engagement. It will be to determine whether this coalition's understanding of honorable combat has been complete, or whether today has revealed how much more there still is to learn." The chamber doors closed once more, sealing us all inside the same uncertain silence we had begun with, though this time, for the first time since I had entered this station, I did not feel like the one on trial. I felt like a man standing at the edge of something far larger than a single battle, watching an entire galaxy quietly begin to change its mind. The recess stretched longer than any of the earlier ones, and I spent most of it standing near the tall observation window overlooking the station's outer ring, watching distant ships drift past like slow, patient stars. Charlotte stood beside me, arms crossed, quiet in the way she always became right before something important was about to happen. "You have not asked me what I think," she said eventually. "I did not think I needed to," I said. "You have been standing here the whole time instead of resting. That tells me enough." She almost smiled. "I think you just changed the way 17 species think about us. Whether the ruling goes our way or not, that part already happened." I did not answer right away, because I was thinking of Thren and the way his composure had thinned but never fully broken, and the vessel that had fled Docking Bay 4 without ever revealing what it had truly been sent to do. I did not believe, not for a moment, that his second plan had ended the instant that ship departed. I was proven right sooner than I expected. Henry found us near the window, moving quickly, his expression carrying a tightness I recognized immediately. "Elias," he said, low enough that only the three of us could hear, "Thren requested a private audience with you before the tribunal reconvenes. Off record. No aides, no translators beyond standard protocol." Charlotte's arms uncrossed slowly. "That is not normal procedure." "No," Henry agreed. "It is not." I considered refusing. Every instinct, built across years of command, told me that walking into a private room with a man whose entire case had just collapsed in front of an audience of 17 species was not a wise decision. But I also understood something else, something I had learned a long time before I ever wore this uniform. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is not the confrontation itself. It is the conversation someone insists on having, only after they have already lost. "I will go," I said. "Charlotte, stay close to the corridor. If I am not back within 10 minutes, assume the conversation went somewhere it should not have." She did not look happy about it, but she nodded, because she trusted me enough to let me make that call, the same way she had trusted me 3 days ago when I ordered our fleet to scatter into a debris field instead of standing in the formation the Jarn expected. The private chamber Thren had requested was small, dimly lit, meant for quiet diplomatic discussions rather than confrontation. He was already standing there when I entered, his back to me, staring out at the same slow-moving ships Charlotte and I had been watching moments earlier. "You did not need to accept this meeting," he said, without turning around. "You did not need to request it," I said. "Yet here we both are." He turned then, and for the first time since this hearing began, I saw him without the armor of his official role, just a person who had built his entire position on a certainty that had just been dismantled in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to him. "You understand what you have done today," he said. "Not simply won an argument. You have shown 17 species that the very foundation of the law they built their trust upon was incomplete. Some of them will not forgive that easily, no matter how correct you were." "I did not do this to earn forgiveness," I said. "I did it because my crew followed an order I gave them, and I was not willing to let them be condemned for surviving." Thren studied me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "There was a vessel," he said finally, "in Docking Bay 4. "I am aware," I said carefully. "It was not mine," he said. "Not officially. Certain members of my delegation believed this hearing could not be allowed to conclude the way it appeared it might. I did not authorize what they intended. I want that understood clearly, Commander, whatever you choose to believe." I studied him, searching for the lie beneath his words, and found something more complicated instead. Not innocence, not guilt. Something closer to a man watching the ground shift beneath positions he had spent his entire career standing upon. "I believe," I said slowly, "that you are the kind of person who built your case honestly, even if others around you did not share your patience for losing with dignity." Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or something close to it. "You do not hate me," he said. "No," I said. "You accused my species of dishonor because everything in your own history told you that deception meant weakness. I do not hate you for believing something your own experience taught you was true. I only needed you to understand that your experience was not the only one that mattered." Thren was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried throughout the entire hearing. "If the tribunal rules in your favor," he said, "I will not contest it further. Whatever the Docking Bay incident becomes, it will be investigated separately from this hearing, and I will ensure my delegation cooperates fully with that inquiry." It was not an apology. It was not quite trust either, but it was something honest, offered without an audience, without translators, without anything to gain from saying it, except the simple relief of no longer carrying a lie into the next chapter of this conflict. "That is enough," I said, "for now." I left the private chamber and returned to the corridor where Charlotte waited, her posture easing the moment she saw me walking normally, unharmed, carrying no visible sign of confrontation. "Well," she said. "He did not order the Docking Bay incident," I said. "Others in his delegation did, without his approval. He is going to let it be investigated properly." Charlotte considered that. "Do you believe him?" "I believe a man who has just lost an argument in front of an entire galaxy no longer has much reason to keep lying about the small things," I said. "The big lie already collapsed. The rest usually follows." We returned to the main chamber just as the doors opened again, and Magistrate Kale took her position at the center of the tribunal seating, her presence commanding immediate silence across every delegation gathered there. "This tribunal has reached its ruling," she said, her voice steady and clear enough to reach the farthest corners of the chamber. "Regarding the conduct of Commander Elias Voss and the human fleet during the Kesserine border engagement, this tribunal finds the tactics employed to be fully consistent with historical precedent submitted and validated under Article 12 of the Combat Accord. No further action will be taken against Commander Voss, his crew, or the Sole Defense Command regarding this matter." A wave of quiet relief moved through me, though I kept my expression steady, aware that every delegate in that chamber was watching how humanity carried victory just as closely as they had watched how we carried accusation. Magistrate Kale was not finished. "This tribunal also recognizes," she continued, "that today's proceedings have revealed a significant gap in this coalition's collective understanding of combat doctrine. The Accord, as currently structured, reflects primarily the historical experience of species whose conflicts were rare and largely ceremonial. It does not adequately account for species whose survival depended on doctrines built under far greater existential pressure. This tribunal recommends a formal review of the Accord's foundational assumptions, incorporating historical precedent from all member species, not merely those most represented in its original drafting." The chamber stirred, delegates turning toward one another in hushed conversation, and I understood, standing there in the center of that room, that something far larger than my own case had just shifted. In the days that followed, 3 separate delegations quietly approached Henry, requesting access to human military archives, not to challenge our precedent, but to study it, curious whether their own histories held similar lessons buried and forgotten simply because no one had ever needed to bring them forward before. The Vresh delegate who had spoken during the hearing became an unexpected ally, later explaining that her own species carried old stories of clever deception during ancient territorial conflicts long before joining the coalition, stories dismissed for generations as embarrassing rather than instructive. "We were taught," she told me quietly, during a private meeting weeks after the tribunal concluded, "that cleverness in war was something to be ashamed of. Your species taught us, without meaning to, that cleverness in war can also be something worth remembering." I did not have a perfect answer for her, only the truth I had carried since the moment I stood in that chamber facing an accusation built on assumptions no one had ever thought to question. "Every species defines honor differently," I said, "because every species survived differently. The mistake is not having a different history. The mistake is believing your history is the only one worth listening to." Charlotte and I returned to the Meridian not long after, resuming patrol duty along the very border that had started this entire chain of events. Kesserine looked quiet now, the debris field we had once used for cover drifting slowly, silently, indifferent to everything it had helped decide. I stood on the bridge, watching the stars shift outside the viewport, thinking of Prosecutor Thren's private confession, of Magistrate Kale's careful, deliberate justice, of an entire galaxy quietly beginning to reconsider assumptions it had never before thought worth questioning. Charlotte joined me near the viewport, her voice quiet, almost reflective. "Do you think this changes anything, long-term?" she asked. "Or does it just become another footnote, buried in some archive, forgotten the same way our own history almost was?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because it deserved a careful answer. "I think," I said, "that for a long time, this coalition believed humanity fought differently because we lacked their patience, their tradition, their sense of ceremony. I think today some of them finally understood we fought differently, because for most of our history, losing was never something we could afford to risk." I looked out at the stars a while longer, remembering the moment I first smiled in that chamber, certain of something no one else in that room yet understood. "They wanted to know why we fought like we had something to lose," I said quietly. "The truth is simpler than they expected. For most of our history, we did, and we never forgot it." The Meridian continued its patrol along the quiet border, carrying forward not just a fleet, but a lesson centuries in the making, finally spoken aloud in front of the very galaxy that had once assumed it already understood everything worth knowing about war.